Okay, let's finish our talk about the Cold War that we started before and got from 1945 when it started, right at the end of World War II, to 1960 when President Eisenhower's term was up and President Kennedy was elected in November of 1960. So there's our description of the Cold War, this 46-year-long conflict, and how in 1960 was a turning point of sorts, not only because Eisenhower retired, but because the concern about MAD, mutually assured destruction, and blowing up the world, had led President Eisenhower and the leader of the Russians, Nikita Khrushchev, to have a couple of meetings known as summit meetings to discuss easing tensions, and how this seemed to maybe have a little bit of potential when all of a sudden one of our planes that was spying on Cuba and taking photographs was shot down by the Russians, and the easing of tensions went out the window. The pilot survived, went to jail in the Soviet Union, was later brought back home, but it ended all plans of a summit meeting. And when Kennedy was elected president, there was a thought in the Soviet Union that Kennedy, who was the youngest man to ever be elected president, was maybe a young whippersnapper that was no match for Nikita Khrushchev. And so they pushed the envelope, you might say. And it led to a crisis in Berlin. And the crisis had to do with East Germans in general crossing through East Germany and entering East Berlin and then walking into West Berlin and then flying away. And so the Russians decided to blockade all of West Berlin. Keep in mind that all of Berlin, east and west, was within East Germany, as you can see on the map there. And in doing that, they prevented people from escaping. It was an embarrassment to them, and it was a way to hurt the West and hurt the United States. They built a wall entirely around the thing, and it led to all kinds of tension. There's the wall. There's another shot of the wall. And in fact, the wall in the 1980s, you can see the wide dead zone on the left there in East Berlin, where you could not get within 100 yards of that wall without being in jeopardy of being shot. And tensions were up, and while tensions were up, a crisis in Cuba came up that diverted everybody's attention away. So in the late 1950s, there was a revolution in Cuba in which a terrible, corrupt dictator was overthrown by a young patriot by the name of Fidel Castro, who also, though, happened to be a communist. And now communism is in our backyard, 90 miles away from Florida, when our policy for the entire Cold War is containment. Don't let it spread. Well, here it spread right next door. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, came up with a plot that turned out to be way off to take some people who had fled Cuba when the revolution happened, give them some guns, put them on boats, and send them back to overthrow Castro. And they did that, except they failed miserably. They got thrown in jail and nothing happened, other than Castro went to the Russians and said, hey, these Americans are trying to overthrow me, protect me. So a year goes by, and it's 1962, and a second one of those U-2 spy planes that we had is surveilling, and it's surveilling over Cuba, and it sees a bunch of missile, you can see where the cursor is, missile silos, launching silos. And in fact, they were setting up missiles, there you can see in the western part of Cuba, aimed at the United States that could have devastated about 2/3 of the United States at the time. So MAD is here. World War III is on the doorstep. What are we going to do? We set up a blockade. We're standing nose to nose with World War III, and finally a couple weeks go by, and the Russian leader agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States removes its blockade, and secretly, if the United States agrees to take its missiles out of Turkey, which were aimed at Cuba. Aimed at the Soviet Union. So the brink of war has been evaded. We're not going to blow up the world in 1962. Everybody's not going to die before morning when they blow up the world. So it's time to take stock. And stock was taken. And a lot of people, Kennedy included, thought we've gone a step too far toward nuclear war. We have to do something. And there was an attempt to try to revive the old idea of easing tensions. And Kennedy came up with what he called peaceful coexistence. Why can't we at least get along? We don't have to like them, and they don't have to like us for us not to blow each other up, is essentially what he was saying. And so this led to an effort to try to ease tensions further than they had been ever during this Cold War. And so they signed a limited test ban treaty. That is, they were not limiting nuclear weapons, but they were banning the testing of new nuclear weapons for a while. And they set up red telephones on the desk of Kennedy and Khrushchev so that if anything happened, they could pick up the phone and call each other directly and say, hey, we're not attacking you at this time. Okay, good. And sort of ease tensions that way. And they were making, it seemed, some progress. 1962 and in 1963. But in November of 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And his attempt to do this didn't exactly die with him, but it certainly put a stop to any personal relationship he had with the Russians. And other problems began to strain the idea of peaceful coexistence at roughly the same time. And the main one of those was the war in Vietnam. And we will talk a little bit about the war in Vietnam, but that time is not going to be today. What we do need to know about Vietnam today was that we were involved in the war in Vietnam from right after World War II right until the mid-1970s. So for 30 consecutive years, the Vietnam War was something that we were involved in. It was quite an involved thing. It involved our theory of containment being expanded to include not allowing communism to expand in Southeast Asia, what President Eisenhower called the dominoes falling in East Asia. And so this was a very long sort of a war that was on again and on seriously again and off again and finally off. From the presidencies of 5 U.S. presidents. So it lasted a whole long time. And there's very much phases and stages of this war. And we will, like I said, talk a little bit about this. One of the military operations that we had there was Operation Rolling Thunder. And it was called that because it was consistent bombing. You could hear the thunder of the bombs 24/7. And we had hoped to have the Vietnam Veterans Group Rolling Thunder roll into Cardinal High School later this spring and speak to us about their experiences in Vietnam, but it doesn't look like that kind of in-class, face-to-face meeting is going to occur, so I don't know that that's going to happen. So the Vietnam War lasted, and we accelerated and escalated our presence right up until 1968 when there was a dramatic North Vietnamese attack called the Tet Offensive. And we'll talk about that later. But it was a wake-up call to the United States that we were in a war that we were not losing, but we certainly didn't appear to be winning at that time. And many protests started at that time. And because of the protests and because of the protracted war, it was something that was controversial in the United States. And when President Nixon was elected in 1968 and took office in 1969, he decided to pull out gradually and, as he called, Vietnamize the Vietnam War. And there were more protests as the war expanded into Cambodia and Laos. There was repercussions at home. Right next to us at Kent State, 4 students were killed in 1970. And in the end, we left in 1973, and in 1975, the North Vietnamese, the communists, defeated our allies, the South Vietnamese. So our guys, our side, lost the war. But you can see that Kennedy was killed in 1963, and this final aftermath is 1975, so it took 12 long years for this to occur, and his peaceful coexistence idea kind of lay, not even on the back burner, off the stove for those 12 years. And of course, the Vietnam Wall and other aftermaths of the war made it a thing that was controversial even up until today, and preoccupies much of our foreign policy cautions around the world that you constantly hear. Do we really want another Vietnam? So, with that, though, the Cold War continued throughout this whole time. In fact, the North Vietnamese were being supplied by the Russians. It was just exactly like the Korean War in that it was what they call a proxy war. The Russians didn't fight, but the North Vietnamese used Russian weapons and Russian equipment. Now, the president, who was President Nixon, tried to pick up this thread of Kennedy's peaceful coexistence, and he rebranded it, as we say. It wasn't Kennedy's program, it was 12 years ago now, but he called it détente, which is a French diplomatic term for meaning easing of tensions. And détente was a continuation, a rebranding, but a continuation of the idea of peaceful coexistence. Can't we all just get along? And so he went to Russia. Nixon did. And there's a new leader in Russia, Leonid Brezhnev. And Nixon and Brezhnev played the part of two good buddies. Nixon went to China and met with Mao Zedong and then walked on the Great Wall of China and made a great pretense that the United States and China were great buddies, or at least could get along. Détente, no tension. And we entered in a series of talks called the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which led to Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, 2 of them, SALT I and SALT II, again, trying to limit nuclear weapons. Nixon had to resign because of Watergate, which we'll talk about briefly, and he was succeeded by Gerald Ford, who was succeeded in 1977 by Jimmy Carter, and the SALT talks continued. They were trying to de-escalate all the tensions right up to 1979, 1980. 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he had a different idea. He rejected the idea of détente, and he said the Soviet Union was just plain evil. He called it the evil empire. And his idea was peace through strength. That is, he would reignite the arms race. He would build more weapons than the Russians could keep up with, was the thinking. He's going to spend $1.5 trillion in 5 years to do that. That's a chunk of change. There was a new defensive idea called Strategic Defense Initiative, or as it was called popularly because of the movies, Star Wars, in which essentially you would shoot down a missile as the missile was coming in to destroy your country. Almost as though 2 people would have a gun, one person would shoot the gun at the second person, and the second person would shoot the gun that instead of hitting the other person would hit the other person's bullet and disable it, and there would be no attack. It would make us invulnerable to a missile attack. It would give us the advantage. Very, very controversial. And in Russia, there was a new leader too by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, and he believed that the Soviet Union was falling behind because they were spending so much money on weapons that the quality of life in the USSR was low. economic system was not quite up to supporting a strong military and the population. So he initiated a series of talks with Reagan, and there were treaties signed there as well, and the idea that we could possibly get along. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty, that was the INF Treaty, was the first one that actually called for reducing nuclear weapons in the 1980s. And he had a couple of programs in Russia to open up the country, in which the economy would open up and people could state an opinion without being killed or sent to the gulag someplace. And Reagan took up the challenge. He said, if you really believe in reforms, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall, meaning that Berlin Wall we started talking about 10 minutes ago. And Gorbachev didn't tear down the wall, but the Berliners did. They knocked it down with sledgehammers. For a while, you could buy pieces of the Berlin Wall as a souvenir. You could buy them on eBay. You may still be able to buy them on eBay. And Berlin was reunited, and Germany was reunited, and Gorbachev didn't do anything to stop it. This was a liberalization. What's going on here? In November of 1989, the Berliners had a mass party. No social distancing there. Look at them. And in Poland, the Poles saw the Germans doing this, and they had an election, and a dock worker by the name of Lech Walesa ran for president on the platform of Polish solidarity against the Soviet Union, basically, and won. And there was an election in which an anti-Soviet president was elected in Czechoslovakia. What's going to go on? And so the generals in Russia said that Gorbachev is too soft. He's too easy. His reforms had done too much, and they were going to do away with it. They were going to arrest him, and they were going to seize control, and they were going to retake control of their satellite states that had kind of broken away. And in 1991, they arrested Gorbachev and were taking over the government. And the mayor of Moscow, a guy by the name of Boris Yeltsin, said, no, you're not. And the Muscovites got out and revolted in the streets and stood up to the Soviet army. And like a house of cards, the Soviet army joined the crowd and the Soviet Union collapsed. Like nothing happened. It just fell apart. And the philosophy has always been that we outspent the Soviet Union with our trillions of dollars worth of missiles and other weapons, and they bankrupted themselves and couldn't keep up, and in the end really didn't want to. The Russian people didn't. 1991, the USSR ceases to exist, and all of the old socialist Soviet republics were now independent Uzbekistans and places like that. And Yeltsin was elected president, who was a popular guy there at the time and an ally of the United States, and all seemed to be well. So why is it still important if that's the case, if it just ended like that? Well, it's not friendly relations anymore. Boris Yeltsin is a man of the past, and Vladimir Putin is not our friend. He is someone, as we've read, has had cyber attacks on the United States over the past several years. The Russian nuclear arsenal still exists. And of course, North Korea, which we talked about before, still exists and has a nuclear arsenal as well. So the Cold War isn't necessarily dead, although it's in long-term hibernation. And the fallout of that led to a world in which there were no two superpowers, just one, and a whole group of people who were revolutionary in their own way. And we'll talk about that another day. Please fill out the second of the two worksheets that you will get. This one, again, has 10 simple questions, and in fact, we've just answered them all. So please watch and listen to this. Fill out your two worksheets and get them turned in. Like I told you yesterday, I'd like to see them all by Friday. That's tomorrow. All right, that's it.